Hi, everyone. We'll just give you a second to all log in. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You are at the Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. This is the final seminar of our winter quarter. So next week we will have a break, and then we will resume on April 1st and go all the way through until June 3rd with a new set of talks every Thursday at 11:30. But we are very excited today to have with us Soleil Prillaman, who is an assistant professor of political science here at Stanford. Her research lies at the intersection of comparative political economy, comparative politics of development, and gender, with a focus on South Asia. She'll be presenting research today on the gender gap and political participation in India, and she received her PhD at the Department of Government at Harvard University in 2017. So Soleil, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thanks, Dee Dee, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to CDDRL for having me and all of you for being here. So as Dee Dee mentioned, I am presenting today some evidence that's part of a larger book project that asks the questions, why are women less politically engaged than men in rural India? And this draws on evidence from around the globe of a persistent gender gap in political participation amongst female citizens. So here is data from the World Values Survey that plots in sort of turquoise the gender gap in voter turnout. So a positive number here would be more men than women turning out to vote by, say, 2 percentage points. And then in red, any political participation outside of voting. So according to the World Values Survey, this would include things like protesting or petitioning the government. And what we see is that while in many regions of the world, the gender gap in voter turnout has largely eliminated or is much smaller than the sort of gender gap in political participation for acts of participation that happen in between election days, with the exception being the Middle East and North Africa. And if we look at South Asia specifically, we see that there's almost no gender gap in voter turnout, but a substantially large, a 20 percentage point gender gap in reported participation in politics in between elections. And to give you sort of further substantiation of this, drawing on some original data from one state in India, what we see is that, again, voter turnout is very high in local elections in rural India for both men and women. So the voter participation rate for men here in red and for women in green, there's very little difference. But when we look at, again, any participation in voting in between election days, and here this encompasses an even broader set of things, such as making claims on the government or attending public meetings, what we see is that about 3 out of every 4 men are participating in politics in some form in between elections, but only about 1 out of every 4 women are doing the same. And I want to highlight that in India, this gender gap in political participation far eclipses the caste gap in political participation that we would see. So again, I'm drawing here, this is data from a nationally representative survey in India. In blue, you have male voter turnout rates. And then down here, the attendance at local public meetings, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second. And in purple, you have the same for women, but the gradations of color here reflect different caste and social categories, with sort of darker colors being historically more elite castes, fading into lighter colors that are scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And what I just want you to take away from this is that there's much less variance across castes within gender than there is across gender. So for example, if we look at attendance at public meetings, while some caste groups are more likely to attend public meetings, the difference between men and women is much larger than the difference across caste groups. And to really sort of paint this picture a little bit more clearly, I wanted to tell you all about two blocks in rural India. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is here in the center. And a block is sort of the second level of geographic administrative unit. You could think of this kind of like a county. And so I want to talk to you first about the block of Godadangri, which is this blue area here. And this is, Godadangri is fairly representative of much of rural India, and particularly rural Madhya Pradesh, where a third of the elected seats are held by women. And this is as a result of mandated, constitutionally mandated reservations. Only about 9% of women report having ever contacted their local leader, and even fewer, only 3% say they've ever filed an application for government services. And this stands in stark contrast to men in these communities that report doing these things, at sort of over 50% of men reporting being actively engaged. And I want to contrast Godadangri with the block of Kesla, which you can see here in red, which neighbors Godadangri. And so as a result, you can imagine, as neighboring counties do, share a lot of similar socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. Sort of in all respects, these two blocks are virtually identical on socioeconomics. But then when we look at political behavior, the block of Kesla looks substantially different. So in Kesla, 80% of local elected positions are held by women, which is far higher than the constitutionally mandated share. And more than 40% of women report having contacted a local leader. More than 25% report having submitted an application, and those applications are non-trivial. 1,900 applications have been submitted in the last 5 years, and they report being successful in a fair share of them. And women in Kesla have organized marches and protests against payment delays for a welfare scheme, against domestic violence, and against alcohol abuse. So why might it be that women are participating in politics in Kesla at substantially higher rates than in Godadangri? So we can try and evaluate this from the prevailing knowledge that we have in the literature. And so most of the literature coming out of higher income Western countries highlights the role of resources in perpetuating gender gaps in political participation. The idea being that gender-based inequalities in political participation are rooted in gender-based inequalities in resources. And by resources, we mean things like education, income, time, political skills, civic skills. Additionally, there's a line of argument that focuses on the economic division of labor and thinks a lot about bargaining power, which is related to resources as well. And the idea of this literature is that it could actually be efficient for households to have a political division of labor that's driven by the economic division of labor, where women take care of the home and men take care of things outside of the home, including both economic matters as well as political matters, which would perpetuate a gender gap in political participation. Drawing on sort of a burgeoning literature in lower income and developing countries, we see that there's a big argument for the role of gender biased norms dictating that women's place is in the household and not in political spaces. And as a result, we see that the argument there is that this is why women bear a higher social cost to participating in more public forms of participation. And then finally, there's a series of arguments that highlight the role of political institutions, and particularly the role of female representation in shaping women's access to politics. The idea being that having female representatives can help to increase aspirations as well as contact with local leaders, drawing women into political spaces. But the women of Kesla had the same income, average education, general bargaining power, employment rates, rates of land ownership, the same structure of the economy, and therefore the same economic division of labor, and identical political institutions that had the same reservations for women as the women in Godadangri, as well as still very patriarchal social norms that dictated the role of women in society. So then what might explain the differences between case law and Gododongri? And I'm going to try to convince you today that an important factor we should consider when thinking about what drives women's political behavior is the degree to which women are socially connected to each other and have political networks outside of the household. And so specifically in this paper, what I'm going to argue is that what drives the gender gap in political behavior is the nature of how households discuss and coordinate political participation, such that households align their political behavior, albeit not because it's necessarily everyone's preference to do so, but because there are incentives to do so. And men, because of greater bargaining power, end up acting as the political agent of the household. But women might benefit from gender-based coordination because this would elevate underprovided gendered interests, but they're constrained by limited political networks and limited social networks outside of the household. And so what I'm going to look at is what happens when women's groups are introduced into some villages in rural India and provide women with a space of coordination and discussion and networks outside of the household. And to do this, I'm going to draw on original data from a survey of just over 5,000 women and half of their husbands from 276 villages in rural India, as well as a natural experiment that determined which villages had access to women's groups and which didn't in an arbitrary fashion. And I'm going to show you that participation in women's groups doubles women's likelihood of participation in between election days. And that the women who participate are those who are able to collectively act with their women's group, but also that participation in women's groups gives women both political information and a space to develop civic skills and voice that then they can utilize in political arenas and political spaces. Okay, so I'm going to start by giving you just a brief context of rural India and the areas that I study. I'll sort of quickly run through the core arguments and then provide you with some evidence based on what I've just discussed. Okay. So as I mentioned, the bulk of this entire study is going to be based in the state of Madhya Pradesh. And Madhya Pradesh is sort of generally representative of India, but most specifically representative of sort of the central belt of India. And in terms of both women's position in society, as well as other socioeconomic factors. The color gradations here represent the sort of average female attendance rate at village assembly meetings, drawing on a nationally representative survey. And what we see is that, like the center of the country, Madhya Pradesh scores sort of at the very low end. So women are particularly politically disenfranchised in this state. Geographically, it's the second largest state in India with a population of 73 million. Like most of India, about 70% of the population reside in rural villages. And then on other indicators like poverty rates and general female labor force participation, Madhya Pradesh looks like India, where about a quarter of women are participating in the labor force. And sort of generally, there's lower rates of female representation at the state level. But specifically, I'm going to be looking at a series of districts in rural Madhya Pradesh that do look a little bit different from the rest of India. So these are communities that are very remote and as a result are sort of majority from scheduled tribes, indigenous populations to India, and where there's very little religious diversity. So about 99% of people report being Hindu, although, as I mentioned, 65% are from scheduled tribes and so also practice tribal religions. This is also an area where the economy is dominated by agriculture. And what this means is that there is a very strong gender division of labor. As I was told once, that the person who plows the field is the one who is responsible for bringing in the income. And so while women do a lot of work on a household's fields, all of the income attributed to agriculture is typically given to men because almost all land is owned by men. And additionally, these are areas that sort of practice patrilineal, patrilocal, and patriarchal norms. So inheritance passes through men, women relocate to men's communities upon marriage, and men sort of have de facto authority in the household and in social spaces. The last thing I want to talk about is what local politics looks like in rural India. And so the Panchayati Raj set of institutions structures local governance in India, where there are 3 tiers of government in the local level, starting at the district, then the block, which is Kesla and Gurugankar, as I mentioned, at the bottom, the Gram Panchayat, which aggregates just a few villages. And I'm going to focus today on political participation in the Gram Panchayat itself. And this is non-trivial, what political participation at this local level means, as the Gram Panchayat is responsible for the provision of local services such as sanitation, water, roads, schools, health centers, and also has the power over the distribution of welfare schemes such as ration cards, as well as subsidized food, and the implementation of welfare programs such as a workfare program named NREGA. And an important part of the Panchayati Raj institution is the implementation of what's called a Gram Sabha, which are, I've mentioned before, these public meetings, a meeting of all eligible voters that constitutionally is required to happen 4 times a year, where anyone can come and sort of express grievances, as well as a community deliberatively decide on the allocation of local public goods and welfare transfers. And then, as I mentioned, the Constitution mandates representation of women at all of these tiers of local government. And so by political participation, what I mean here is what we typically think of, voting, of course, but also all of the ways that citizens interact with their local governments in between elections. And so this includes things like attending the Gram Sabha, or these public meetings, simply communicating with elected representatives. And it's important to note that these local representatives live in these communities and so are actually quite accessible. And you'll see this in very high rates of communication from men. Filing of petitions to locally elected representatives, as well as things like working with political parties, including mobilizing votes during elections and attending party rallies, even though technically political parties are not allowed to operate in local elections. And then finally, including things like protesting. So the range of political activities that happen both on election days and around elections, but also on all of the intervening days in between. Okay, so a brief summary of the argument, and I'll try to be quick so I can get to the evidence in time. So I start from the premise that our political behavior is not determined in a vacuum as an individual, but that in fact, our political behavior is influenced by others in our social network. And in particular, influenced by those within our political network, which I define as those with whom we discuss politics, elections, and government, drawing on sort of a large and rich literature on political networks. And what this literature tells us is that political networks shape our political behavior in a few ways. They facilitate the acquisition of information about politics and how to engage in politics. Political networks can impose social pressure to conform to group norms. You can think here about the fact that we all wear stickers when we vote to signal that voting is a socially accepted and desired attribute. But political networks can also shape our political preferences, elevating some preferences to the forefront, potentially even revealing others that we hadn't fully conceptualized. And political networks also can solve coordination problems that are inherent with information constraints. They can allow us to either collectively act and collectively coordinate, or even be sort of mobilized by elites as a group because of these information constraints. But given the multitude of people and groups with whom we engage, which do we politically align our behavior with? And so I think about 3 components here. The constraints that we have, namely the networks that we're a part of, our available social ties, the preferences that we have and how those are shared across our network. And so we're most likely to align our behavior with those whom share our closest political preferences, but also groups that have low coordination costs, for whom aligning our behavior does not imply larger costs. And then lastly, that this is also a function of broader patterns of strategic mobilization, where particular group coordination may be reinforced by the strategic mobilization done by political elites, where it's cheaper for elites to mobilize the support of a group than to, say, target all individuals. And so when thinking about what may drive women's political alignment and coordination in rural India, we know that women share political preferences with many social groups. First and foremost, household-based preferences may dominate women's preferences. For example, this could be because of like local club goods and public goods that are shared sort of equally across the household. If a water pump is really far away from the house, that might affect all household members, albeit disproportionately. And additionally, with many welfare schemes being allocated at the household level, such as ration cards, we can imagine that households will share preferences. There may also be ethnicity-based preferences that again would be shared if households are all from the same ethnic group. But then women also may have gender-based preferences, things like that stem from the division of labor that allocate certain tasks like the collection of water to women, and therefore where women have a disproportionate stake in water provision, or things that sort of are more direct in terms of issues around violence against women, which is something that sort of we see coming up a lot through interviews in rural India. And so while women may share a lot of preferences with other women, there are high costs to coordination outside of the household for women. And I argue this stems from a few things. The first is because of the institution of patriarchality, women at the time of marriage are uprooted from their natal villages and the networks that they developed through schooling and through childhood, and instead migrate to their husband's village, at which point they face high mobility constraints. So for example, from a nationally representative survey, we see that almost 80% of women were originally from another village as compared to only 10% of men. Additionally, the economic division of labor may lead to women's economic lives being centered in the household, creating sort of less incentive for network development and access outside of the household. And then lastly, social mobility constraints may limit women's social networks in these communities. And so, for example, drawing on the same survey data from across India, 72% of women report having to ask permission from a male family member simply to visit their friends socially. And of those, less than 20% say they would be allowed to do so alone, as well as less than 10% of women report being a member of any civil society group. And I want to highlight that these constraints to coordination are credible and imposed through one mechanism being the threat of violence, with 32% of women in India reporting having been abused by their husband in the previous year. And we know that these rates of reporting are likely lower than true rates of experience. And so while women may share preferences with other women, there are high coordination costs because of this steep social disconnectedness. And women also share preferences with their household, and where there are lower costs to coordination. So by and large, more often, women are likely to align their political behavior with the household. And so who in the household then would act as the political agent in costlier forms of participation where you wouldn't necessarily want everyone to participate? And I'm happy in Q&A to talk about why I think voting looks quite different. And so I argue that this is the person with the lowest cost to participation, i.e. the greatest resources and the most bargaining power. And in both of these situations, the economic division of labor privileges men. But then men also have coercive power through this threat of violence that I've mentioned that can further solidify their place as the political agent. And then finally, women also face steeper social costs to political participation because of the dominance of patriarchal norms. So all of this together suggests that more often than not, men are going to act as the political agent of the household. And this becomes a self-sustaining system where, because men are participating in politics and representing the household in political affairs, they accumulate greater political information, skills, networks that then solidify their position. And politicians also see men as the representative and are more likely to mobilize men into politics. So all of this would imply, if the system is correct, it would imply that we would see a gender gap in political participation, where we see sort of a system of gender-based insiders and outsiders, but that the women who have the lowest social mobility constraints, the greatest resources and bargaining power, are the women who are themselves most likely to participate in politics. We would also see an alignment of household preferences and household voting behavior, where household-based preferences end up privileged, and gendered preferences, particularly women's preferences, underprovided. And we would then see broader political organization around shared household identities. But I'm going to argue that one way, not necessarily the only way to break this system, is to introduce women's groups, and that women's groups have the potential to politically incorporate women by bringing women out of the household and connecting them to other women. And if women have these shared preferences that are underprovided as a result of household coordination, there are incentives to engage in the political system. And women's groups allow for this for three reasons. First and foremost, they allow women to collectively act to gain autonomy from the household, and through this collective action and sort of mass mobilization to contest the forces of coercion, both within the household as well as within social structures that would try to sort of exclude women in the first place. But they also have the capacity to reduce inequalities in political resources and political skills by sort of sharing information amongst group members and providing a space for the development of political voice and confidence. So I'm now going to provide you with the evidence to support this. And so the question that I'm really trying to ask in this paper, and as I mentioned, this is part of a larger book project, so happy to talk about other pieces of evidence as well in Q&A, is does access to social networks affect women's political behavior? But networks are endogenous, and it's really hard to distinguish the effect of networks from what determines how you opt into networks. And so what I'm going to do is exploit as if random variation in access to an NGO program that mobilized women into small microcredit groups. And specifically, this program mobilized women into what are called self-help groups, which are groups of 10 to 20 women in a village that meet weekly, mostly for informal savings and credit provision. And the groups that I look at were mobilized by the NGO PRADESH, and had on average been meeting for 6 years at the point at which I study these groups, which I think is important. These are not sort of temporary savings and loan groups that sort of conclude after a year when all funds are dispersed. These are meant to be an institution that women engage with and really get to know each other. And as a result, after all of the finances are done, typically women sit around and chat and engage, and that can quickly turn into political discussion. And so what I'm going to use to identify these effects is the way that PRADESH determined which communities they would provide this program to. And so within a district, this is one district in Madhya Pradesh, what they would do is they would first establish a headquarters location for their office, which was usually not a major city. It was some rural village center because they wanted to reach the most remote communities. And then they would determine the radius around which they believed they could travel in a day to actually reach a group. So on average, this was about 25 kilometers. And then from within this radius, they would select the villages that they believed most needed a financial intervention. So these are typically going to be the poor communities, communities with larger shares of tribal populations, for example. So what I'm going to do is use this sort of arbitrary boundary that was set to identify villages just across the border of this boundary that could have or would have plausibly been chosen to receive this intervention if the boundary had been just a bit larger. And so I'm going to take the set of villages shown here in blue that were not chosen for the program, but that are close to the border. And I'm going to pair match those with villages that were chosen across the border based on the attributes used for selection, things like the share of the tribal population and socioeconomic conditions in the village, such that these two villages across the border look the same on all observables, but also we can assume are very similar on unobservable characteristics because they are so geographically proximate. And I'm going to find the best set of matches and then subset to that to create pair matches for analysis and comparison, where I'm going to look at the women within the treated groups and compare those to women in these villages that did not receive this program. And so just to talk through this again, I started using this pair matching strategy to sample villages. But then, because what I want to, not all women are participating in these groups. And in fact, within a village, women select into whether or not they join a group. What I'm going to do is match women at the individual level across these villages based on observables, such that the women that I'm going to talk to in control villages are the ones who would likely have chosen to be in a self-help group had they had the option. And I'm going to be able to do this because the main and almost exclusive reason women join these groups is for financial need. And I'll give you a little evidence for that. And then I'm going to estimate sort of the effect of this program on women who selected into the program. But because that might be a concern for, that maybe there's some unobservables that would determine selection, I'm also going to use a random sample of women from 2 districts to estimate the average effect on women more broadly. Okay. And to do this, I'm going to use survey data, as I mentioned, that, where I surveyed 15 women from each village and half of their husbands. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to say that while in many respects, these the people who were surveyed were representative, in some respects, like, for example, socioeconomics and the scheduled tribe share, there are substantial differences relative to the state and all of India. And I wanted to sort of argue that that the selection mechanism of opting into these groups on financial access was really what was driving this. And so when we asked women why they chose to join an SHG, 94% of them said that it was purely because of financial access. And it really is not just because of financial access that women join, but because of the need for credit that men allow women to join these groups. I won't talk about this, but just to say that if you look at, if you compare the control and treated villages, they look the same on observable village characteristics as well as observable individual level characteristics. Okay, so I don't have much time, but I'll quickly walk through some of the main effects. And so this is the real big takeaway table. And what I have here in the rows are the key dependent variables. And I have the estimated effect on SHG members in the first column, as well as the average effect across all women in the second column, meaning that this is averaging across women who both opted in and did not opt into the program in their villages. And what we see is, while the SHG program had no effect on voting, it had a huge effect on non-voting political participation. So for example, it almost doubled women's likelihood of attending a village assembly meeting, SHG members' village assembly meeting, although this is attenuated when we look at averages across all women. It increased things like making claims on local government, making claims at the block. Essentially, women were just much more likely to be politically active in between elections. So why might this be? I think there are 3 main mechanisms for which I have some suggestive evidence at play. The first and sort of most important is that these women's groups provided a space to facilitate collective action, which is critical when you're going to be faced with substantial resistance and backlash both within the household and within the community when you try to engage in politics. But they also help spread information and increase women's civic skills and confidence. But what I'm also going to show you is that it's not that these groups are fundamentally changing women's position in society, that they do not increase women's economic resources or alter their bargaining power, which is surprising given that this is an economic group in the first place. So again, I'm going to go quickly through these next tables just for time's sake, but what we see is that participation in these women's groups substantially increased the size of women's reported social network, as well as the propensity for women to say that they were discussing politics with other women and with their friends. And when we look at just the women in treated villages and try to predict which of those women are the ones who ended up participating in politics following this intervention, what we see is that it's the women who stated that they discussed the village with the SHG, so they discussed village issues within their women's group, the ones who explicitly stated that they discussed petitioning the Panchayat within their group, and that they met with their group outside of meetings for political endeavors. So really that there was collective action being mobilized through these groups. But additionally, and again, I won't spend too much time here, but what we see is that there is a substantial increase in women's reported political information and political knowledge, both on subjective indicators of political knowledge, as well as objective indicators of political knowledge, such as knowing the limits for a local welfare program. As well as the program increased women's belief of their own political efficacy substantially, as well as marginally increased their confidence, particularly their confidence to engage in large groups. But the last point that I want to make is that if you remember, these are microcredit groups. So we might be worried that what's really happening here is these microcredit groups are both providing households with more money and therefore more capacity to engage in politics, as well as providing women with more economic bargaining power. And while I see that women had greater decision-making power as a result of this, or reported being involved in more decisions, I see no indication that this changed any of the fundamentals of bargaining power. Women were no more likely to own assets, to own land, to be employed. They reported no less domestic violence, and their households reported zero effect on their assets and as well as their general consumption. And in fact, the only effect we do see is a negative one. So these groups really did not change either the economic position of the households that were participating, nor did it change women's position within those households fundamentally. And so just to wrap up, I think that what I've shown today is that even in societies where there are strong patriarchal norms, where the division of labor and bargaining power all stands against women, there is hope for women to gain access to political institutions, and this can come through collective action amongst women organized through women's groups. And I think that this has implications for our broader understanding of political behavior in thinking about how and when it may be that gender becomes a mobilizing identity, as well as helps to elucidate some of the mechanisms of social capital and how who you associate with may matter for your political participation. I also think that there are implications of this research for local governance and the distribution of public goods. We know, for example, that when women enter politics, policies change. And so the incorporation of women as citizens may have fundamental implications for governance and outcomes. And then finally, I think that there are some really important implications for how we think about economic development. So many people will look at microcredit programs and self-help groups and see that they're, generally that there's not much of an effect on economic outcomes, which I find here as well, and suggest that these programs have failed. But in fact, what I see is that there are these large unintended consequences of these programs for women's political behavior that may lead us to want to think differently as we determine the efficacy. So I'll end there and say thank you for your time, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Soleil, for that great presentation and all of that amazing field work. So if you have any questions, audience, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box and we'll be sure to get to them in the remaining time that we have. So my first question, Soleil, is if you tried to capture at all the effects of ways these women could communicate with one another, say through mobile apps or social media, just because there's been so much information and evidence about how information spreads, particularly individual to individual, and if women could receive and discuss political information with each other in these groups, were they also receiving information from other places?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, there's sort of a clear answer here, which is that I did collect this information, and about 5% of women report owning their own mobile phone. And so with respect to technological advances, there's very, very low access to mobile technology as well as to social media. That said, in addition to conversation happening within these groups, I think one of the things that's interesting and that speaks to maybe older technology of how we might share information. An example of a set of interviews I did in one village, these women had come up with this sort of informal institution to share information outside of the group, where particularly they were concerned about the prevalence of domestic violence in their community, but they knew that that's not something you can just talk about openly. And so what they did was they established a rule that if a woman had placed a broom just outside her front door, that meant that she was in a heated argument and concerned about her safety in the household. And so if any woman walking by had seen that broom, she was meant to go and corral the rest of the group and come and sort of police this behavior on their own. So while it's not quite the answer to the question that you asked, I think it suggests that that these women devised really smart and strategic ways of communicating both inside and outside of these groups.
No, that's a great answer. And so we have a question now about the relationship between development and the groups and the original purpose of these groups. Given that these microeconomic groups didn't make a difference economically, what do you think it would take to make a difference in economic development at the local level and particularly within families?
Yeah, that is a good question, and not one that I feel particularly qualified to speak on based on evidence that I have from this, but I'll try my best. And I think there's a broad set of different programs that are being studied. So I think a few things I would highlight that do stem from this evidence. The first is that what we see here is that these programs, while they didn't have this effect of shifting economic structures in the way that they were intended to, they do seem to be starting social change. And I think that there's actually quite an open question as to whether or not this social change is going to lead to economic development in the long run. As I said, we know that when women become active members of politics, they actually tend to demand and implement development programs at higher rates than men. So I think that it's still an open question as to whether or not this program has failed with respect to economic development. It's just that the path to economic development may look very different than we originally imagined that it would.
If you were giving this talk to the World Bank and they were asking you to evaluate different kinds of micro lending type programs, what broad takeaways would you advise to economic development agencies?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would advise is to think broadly about what outcomes to measure and to use as a measure of success, and to think about exactly what that means for processes of change and our theories of change. And so I think, if you actually look at, there's a meta-analysis of micro programs, and they say something like only 5% of studies even looked at political outcomes as part of the study. So I think that would be the first thing I would suggest. The second thing is I would say, well, if what you're seeing are the effects like what I'm seeing here, I think it really speaks to understanding the mechanisms a bit more. I think this program in particular, with respect to this broader discussion around development, is a really unique one. This is a place where an NGO invested a huge amount of energy to facilitate weekly meetings and really work within these communities for decades. These effects that we're seeing were not coming after 1 year of meeting. And I think we're often looking for a silver bullet to get us to sort of broader development that also lifts women at the same time. And I think, if anything, what I'd like my research to show is that sort of elevating women's position, empowering women within these communities requires a fundamental shift in social spaces, fundamental social change. And I think what we're starting to see here is the beginnings of that. And it happened after, on average, 6 years. And I think we'll see where this carries forward and whether this has broader implications. But I think, seeing it as not just we need a sort of add water and grow strategy, but let's really think about how these what are the constraints that are faced to both women's empowerment and economic development? What are the sort of social constraints that they face, and what are the ways that we can get there that may lead us in the long run to the long run goal? It's not something I've looked at, but after having many conversations with these women, my strong suspicion is that the way that their daughters are going to grow up is going to be very different as a result. And so again, it's a long-term view of what development can look like.
That's really interesting. Do you find that, so I really like the relationship here between a theory of networked participation and social capital development. And we know that social capital can also be fostered through any number of other means. And so I'm going to try to link here education, social capital development, and also women's political participation. Do you find that women make different investment decisions, or families, in their children once they've participated in these political groups? In particular, are they more likely to educate girls, or have these, go through these other pathways of building more capital within their communities?
So I can give you, I don't have direct evidence on that outcome, but I can give you a series of suggestive evidence that may paint a picture that the answer to that could be yes. So the first thing is that we know that when women become political representatives in their community, that aspirations amongst young women increase substantially. And so we also know that the same can happen within the household. So it would not be surprising to me that we would find that young women's aspirations would change as a result of having a mother or a set of women who are actively engaged in the community. The second thing to note is that I didn't mention this, but 95% of these women are illiterate. And yet when we look at their children, education amongst young women in India is increasing at a really high rate. And I would guess that these kinds of interventions are only going to facilitate that. I've had so many conversations with these women about how they believe they now understand, as a result of talking more about this and seeing the value of things like education, that, if there's only one child who can be educated, it shouldn't necessarily be their son, that there is real value in educating women. And I think the last thing I'll say to that speaks to the last question as well, about sort of what should we be investing in. And one of the things to the credit of this NGO is, when presented with this information, as well as with their own intuition that this is really what their programs were changing, they decided to lean into it. And so they created a series of gender interventions that aimed to try to empower this aspect of these groups. This is not within this study, but we actually have a separate study working on this, where they went in and they tried to facilitate conversations amongst the groups about gender norms, about bias, as well as about the value of sort of women's political behavior and coordination. And we sort of got some preliminary evidence out of that study, and the effects I've shown here are just the starting point. What we see after that is that things increase substantially more, and that when women really sort of realize and have this sort of gender consciousness raising within these groups, which sort of harkens back to some of the things from even the history of the US, that really that's where some of this social change becomes catalyzed.
Right, that's amazing. So I'm going to ask our postdoc, Leah Rosenzweig, to unmute and ask you a question directly.
Great, thanks Didi, and thanks Olay, this is awesome. So I guess I'm a little bit curious about the mechanism, and some of your sort of answers to the most recent questions suggest maybe one way, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So, you could imagine that perhaps there's a bit of like pluralistic ignorance going on, meaning that maybe there isn't a norm against women's participation in politics, at least among women, but there's this expectation that there is. So really, like, if you asked women about how they think other people will react, they think that it's more negative than the actual reaction would be, versus a different kind of mechanism, though related, which is like this actual changing of the norm within these groups. And so I guess I'm curious if you have survey data from before and after the intervention, both for men and women, to see whether it is about sort of providing information about how other people's beliefs and attitudes, what they are, but then also if those are changing. So are we sort of shrinking the gap between my expectation of other people's beliefs about, the social acceptability of these behaviors, or are we actually changing the social acceptability of these behaviors?
Yeah, it's a really great question. How much of this is actually updating versus changing? And I think there's two answers here that differ based on whether this is about within women versus within the society as a whole. So within these women's groups, I think it's a little bit of both, but I think a lot of what's happening is updating. And I don't have direct evidence on this in this study, but countless interviews, women would talk about they did not realize that they were the only ones who were experiencing violence in the household, and that because these topics came up in conversation in these groups, they realized that this was sort of a systemic problem, and that, you know, they were not at fault or necessarily unique in those experiences. And many of these norms become quite internalized. And so by sort of having space to contest those norms, as well as just to open up and sort of reveal a set of preferences that may have been lying dormant, certainly that is part of what's happening in these groups. That said, I think that what is happening here outside of these groups is much more around the change side as opposed to the updating side. And what I can say about that is, or sort of the evidence I have there, is I've looked a lot into how was this political participation navigated, and why are women's groups in particular necessary? Why is this collective action component necessary? And the answer seems to come from the fact that these women's groups face substantial backlash and resistance within the broader community. So the number of women who have told me that they went to these public meetings and, you know, at the low end, they were relegated to sit on the floor in the back of the room. That's like a fairly universal experience. At the high end, they were beaten out of these rooms with sticks and not allowed to be a part of these spaces. And so I think that, you know, this is why having a critical mass of women who can actually contest this backlash and these high social costs is important. And while I don't know that I have evidence that we're at the point where norms have changed, I would not go that far, because this is sort of a partial equilibrium. We're seeing sort of the renegotiation of these norms in process, but we haven't quite seen where they land yet. But because of that sort of backlash, push forward process, it suggests to me that this is more than just updating about beliefs, and that now that women are sort of demanding representation, they'll just be given it. That's not what I'm seeing, that they'll just be given access to politics.
So we have a question from Brett Carter, one of our visiting scholars, who says that, who's asking what other programs we could be investing in particular about domestic violence, which is so interesting that you found that link to how women can empower themselves to talk about it or share information about it. So, of course, gender-based violence and domestic violence enforces gender roles and stereotypes within families and communities. So what kinds of programs might be able to change norms around violence at the local level or constrain violence within households?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's something that keeps me up at night. So I can empathize with the asking of the question. I do want to caveat my answer that this is not something I have evidence on. And so everything I'm saying is purely speculative. I think that far more research in this domain would be really valuable. And I know that there are lots of people working on this, and it's something that I hope to work on myself in the future. That said, I think a couple of things maybe can be gleaned from this. One is that what we are, I did sort of highlight that there's this program now that's trying to actually foster conversation and support networks amongst these groups to handle this. Now that's not necessarily, it's not clear whether or not that's going to reduce domestic violence, which is much more structural and involves potentially needing to bring legal charges and things like that. But I think that, you know, it at least the hope is that it will change awareness as to what's acceptable. If, for example, you look at DHS, NFHS data from India, what you see is that more than 50% of women say that it's socially acceptable for their husband to beat them under some condition. So for example, if they don't cook the food correctly, and that's even higher than it is for men. So I don't want to say that those interventions are the best way to reduce violence, because I think that, putting that on these groups is a lot to ask of the groups, but it at least is creating that updating that Leah was asking about, and that solidarity amongst women, such that they, may be able to access information and seek support better. And again, I'm hesitant to talk, the issue of violence is just such a prevalent, pervasive, and really important one. I don't want to proffer something that could be inaccurate, but I do think a takeaway from this work is that that women face coercion in sort of all stages of their existence, in the household, in the community. And my takeaway from this is that providing women with solidaristic, deeply connected groups where they can navigate these spaces, provide just a lot more power to then contest this. And so while I don't see any effects on reducing domestic violence explicitly, and there's any number of reasons why this could be, including sort of reporting differences, et cetera. I do think, providing women with sort of spaces to have these conversations and to build solidarity, it can be really valuable regardless.
Right. Okay, so final question after this great presentation is, there's been such political activism in India recently around farmers' protests, for example, and Modi's changing policies around agriculture, and also protests against some of Modi's other policies that are, more ethnically targeted. Do you have any just observational sense of how women's political participation has shaped the broader protest movement and across various policy areas in India?
Yeah, great question. And I'll give a little bit of an answer, but in some ways it's a TBD. I actually I'm working with a student right now to collect data on exactly this. And what I can say from what I've seen so far is what this study speaks to is a very, very micro social movement. These are women at the most micro level, sort of organizing and collectively acting. But what we also have seen in India over the last couple decades is a rise in women's mobilization against particularly issues of violence against women. Notably, there have been huge protests amongst women because of gang rape cases in Delhi and elsewhere, as well as there have been, the chain of women that existed in Kerala. And so I think there has been a lot of forward pushing by women through these very visible forms of protest. I don't know that I would say they've precipitated the farmers' protest. And in fact, I think while there are a few key female leaders of that, those remain largely a sort of male-dominated protest. I do think that, there is a rise in sort of women's collective action and protesting more broadly. We've seen patterns of sort of rising voter turnout rates amongst women. And so, and I should say, this, again, I'm speaking anecdotally, but things like these, the Ministry of Rural Development has now scaled up self-help groups, for example, to reach millions and millions and millions of women. And so I think there's potentially hope that that this is going to facilitate greater political participation. But just to caveat, as I mentioned in my response to Leah, I think we're in that process right now. We're in the process of negotiating change, and so where we land is, I think, still yet to be determined.
All right, well, thank you so much for this great line of research, and best of luck on your future projects. We're all very excited for your book. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, Soleil.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.